So when we divide the 20th century into different time periods, we tend to consider the post-1945 period until the 80s or the 90s through the lens of the Cold War. And in the case of Northeast and Southeast Asia, this seems all the more justified that in this region, the Cold War was actually not cold at all. Right? And hot conflicts, violent conflicts, started soon, arguably with the Korean War of 1950-1953, which pitted not only South and North Korea against one another, but also the US and China with Soviet backing. However, World War II, of course, did not turn into the Cold War right away. This process took time. How then should we look at the transition phase, these years after 1945, where uncertainty was still prevailing and the global opposition between socialist and capitalist forces was not entirely crystallized yet? This phase could be framed as the origins of the Cold War in Asia, for instance. It's a way of looking at it from the vantage point of what came afterwards. Such an approach would focus on the deepening of the antagonism between communist and anti-communist forces in the region and on their gradual alignment with world powers. For instance, it would focus on the victory of the communists in China and the formation of the Sino-Soviet alliance. But what if we try looking at this phase another way, not from the vantage point of what came afterwards, what came next, but from the vantage point of what had come before? What if we ask not about what kind of time period the region was entering, i.e. the Cold War, but what kind of time period the region was leaving or exiting? This perspective is important because it takes into account the very simple fact, that historical actors possess not only hopes and expectations and anticipations, but also memories, and that these memories weigh very heavily on their course of action. Seen from this angle, then, the answer is quite simple. For a vast number of people in Northeast and Southeast Asia, the post-1945 years were what came after the Japanese Empire, Japanese domination. Japanese rule had been of diverse nature and durations in the region. Korea and Taiwan, for instance, had been colonized by Japan for decades. A large part of China had been invaded and then occupied after 1937. The Chinese Northeast, what we sometimes call Manchuria, was occupied by a pro-Japanese regime from 1932 to 1945. And as for Southeast Asia, territories such as Java, Burma, or Singapore, they had been occupied by Japan after 1942, when Imperial Japan ousted their former European colonial overlords. Right? So for all these regions, the 1945 war was, more than anything else, the end of Japanese rule. So on the surface, this end of Japanese dominion in the region was very sudden, right? Because the Tokyo government announced it would surrender to the Allies on August 15th, 1945, and then in a matter of weeks, the Japanese Empire became a thing of the past. So it was a very, very quick process. In practice, however, dismantling the Japanese Empire was a very long process, fraught with many difficulties, such as the displacement of populations, for instance, the trials of collaborators and war criminals, the reconstruction of regions destroyed by war, and also of local economies that had been disconnected from the networks of the Japanese Empire they were inserted in before the end of the war. And there was also, of course, the huge question of political legitimacy, right? Because competition to replace Japanese authorities was harsh, and it was often very violent. And the transition was all the more difficult and all the more delicate that 1945 in the region was not just the end of the Japanese Empire, it was also the end of World War II. Right? So, like many empires, Japan had mobilized its peripheries for the war effort. And it had done so with peculiar energy for material reasons, because Japan was in desperate need of manpower during the war, but also for ideological reasons, because we have to remember that Japanese propaganda during the Pacific War presented the war against first China and then against the Allies in general as an effort to build a new Asian order where Japan would take the benevolent lead of other nations. And this mobilization went through different channels. For instance, the Japanese state and army took control of the economies. Forced labor was massive, and it also included the so-called comfort women, which is forced sex labor, because it's women who were forced into prostitution for Japanese soldiers. Colonized or occupied populations joined the Japanese Imperial Army, like in Taiwan and Korea, or sometimes they joined formerly independent pro-Japanese forces, like in Java or Burma, partly as auxiliaries, partly as conscripts, partly as volunteer soldiers. They were also enrolled in a vast array of paramilitary and youth organizations, such as youth leagues, for instance. Mines were also mobilized. The war effort came along with intense propaganda in favor of Japan's sacred war, was the expression, of its unique world historical mission, and of course, its semi-divine emperor. As a result, the dismantling of the Japanese Empire was also, at the same time, an aftermath of war, and it entailed a very vast process of demobilization, which came along with a lot of difficulties. So the first challenge, among many, was the demobilization of colonial subjects serving in the Japanese army in different capacities. For Taiwan and Korea only, this represented hundreds of thousands of men, right? At the end of the war, I mean. Many were stationed overseas and had to be repatriated, which often took months, because for the US Army, the number one priority was to repatriate Japanese citizens and not colonial subjects. But even when this was done, the repatriation, the status of these men remained very uncomfortable. First, they experienced a drop in social status and often unemployment in the troubled post-war economic situation. Second, these people had fought not only for the losing side, but also for the former colonial master. So they were denied an honorable defeat, of course, and they also became objects of suspicion for the new governments. On the other hand, though, they were a resource for the different contenders for power where authority was contested or disputed. This was, for instance, the case in Korea, where southern authorities under American occupation resorted to former colonial soldiers to create an armed force because they had no other solution. This was also the case in Manchuria, where the nationalists and the communists who were fighting a civil war fought over the remnants of the pro-Japanese forces. The problem was different in those territories of Southeast Asia where Japan had created formerly independent armies because of decolonization. In a way, in these regions, there was very little demobilization because the Japanese trained forces continued the fight against white European colonizers. It was the case, for instance, against the Dutch in Java. Because mobilization was so widespread during the war, demobilizing was not limited to veterans. For former members of mass organizations and paramilitary groups as well, Japan's defeat entailed both liberation on the one hand, but on the other hand, an element of loss. Youth leagues, for instance, had been massively expanded in Japanese colonies during the war. And although they were for sure a proxy for state mobilization and very coercive state mobilization, they also became a place where young men of relatively modest backgrounds could experience a measure of upward mobility and experience a sense of community as well. And to a point, these people came under suspicion after the war for the same reasons former soldiers, so veterans, did, right? And for them too, demobilization was slow and it was often partial. The collapse of the Japanese Empire created local disorder, and the void was soon filled with these men who had an experience of organizing, an experience of bearing arms, and who were looking for a new social role. The authorities had very often little choice but accepted, and paramilitary groups could also be used for political purposes. In Korea, for instance, they were very often mobilized by the local people's committees, whose self-attributed task was to prepare independence. Ignoring or marginalizing these people, these demobilized men, soldiers or former members of paramilitary groups, could be dangerous, as the nationalist Chinese authorities experienced in Taiwan in 1947, when a spontaneous revolt erupted against corruption and misrule in this year in Taiwan. Former members of the Imperial Army and of youth leagues played a leading role in violent action. So imperfect demobilization, in a way, could lead to remobilization under certain circumstances. So last, there was the challenge of cultural and ideological demobilization. Japan's wartime discourse on the liberation of Asia could not be taken seriously by most people in East and Southeast Asia, especially at the end of the war, because it was too clearly at odds with the violence and discrimination and exploitation of actual Japanese rule. And after Tokyo's defeat, there was little ground for nostalgia in most of these regions. Nevertheless, the mobilization of minds did have lasting effects in the post-war period. First, for many young Asian men, much less for women, the culture of Japanese militarism had been both coercive and empowering, because before the war, colonial discourse, Western and Japanese, tended to present Asians under foreign rule, as weak, effeminate, and incapable of ruling themselves. During the war, on the contrary, this discourse shifted. Japanese authorities now explained to young colonized men that they could become heroes in a sacred war, that they could share in a great empire, the Koreans and Taiwanese, or conquer independence in Southeast Asia. In short, that the future belonged to them. The whole point of this flattery, of course, was to get these men to fight and potentially die for Japan. But Japanese authorities were not monolithic. Lower to middle echelon civilian and military instructors often took their Pan-Asian proclamations seriously. And in any case, the sincerity of wartime Japanese propaganda was in a way less important than its effects. In addition to actual training and membership in mass organizations, or the army, it gave young men a sense of self-worth and sometimes a sense of mission. And this feeling did not vanish overnight upon Japan's defeat in 1945. It was rather redirected towards new goals, like mobilization for independence, mobilization against an oppressive government, or against political enemies. This helps explain the frequency of violent political activism among the youth in the former Japanese wartime empire in the years that followed 1945. War mobilization also influenced post-war boundaries between friends and foes, albeit in a differentiated way. Japanese fascism, which was hostile to communism, Western imperialism, and capitalism, tried to foster the perception of common enemies in the Asian territories it occupied. In the post-war period, the imprint of Japanese anti-communism could still be seen among some groups, like the Korean right wing, for instance. As for Japanese anti-Western discourse, it of course still had purchase in Southeast Asia, where it resonated very directly with the continued struggle for national liberation. But this anti-Western discourse, on the other hand, had very little echo in Japan's own former colonies, like Taiwan. Lastly, a more discrete legacy of Japanese occupation in Southeast Asia was a heightened anti-Chinese sentiment. In that region, so Southeast Asia, fascist Japan's hostility to capitalism was coupled with attacks on overseas Chinese merchants in an attempt to create common grounds between the occupiers and the local population. And this radicalized existing tensions, and it could be one of the sources of post-war anti-Chinese violence in places such as Malaya or Indonesia.